archaic way of using paper. Here's the last part. We're going to be in Acts tonight. Chapter 14, and it's been a few weeks since we have looked at it. Get to the close of the chapter. Let me get there. Paul, and we're looking at, I think what verse we got to. Looks different on paper than it is on my tablet. I'm going to find it. We got down to the end of about 17, 18, didn't we? Thought so. All right, so we'll read verse 14 through 18 just to refresh our minds. So Paul is at Lystra with Barnabas, and they have been called two different things. What were they called? What were they had spoke, they had done a miraculous thing here by healing that Gentile man who was crippled. And so what did the people, the Gentiles of this area, call Paul and Barnabas?
Zeus and Hermes.
Yeah, Zeus and Hermes. Zeus, there you go. Or Jupiter. You say Susan?
I did not.
Susan and Hermes. No, I don't think there was a Greek goddess that was called Susan. I don't know, maybe. And so here we have, they're called Zeus and Hermes. And so there's two different words for it, names for it. Where is it at on my... It throws me off when I'm looking at paper. My tablets, everything's right there. And Mercury. That was the one. Jupiter and Mercury. And so they were falsely, of course, called that. And we see in verse 14, it says, "But when the apostle Barnabas and Paul heard this, they tore their clothes and ran in among the multitude, crying out and saying, 'Men, why are you here doing these things? We also are men with the same nature as you, and preach to you that you should turn from these useless things to the living God, who made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all things that are in them, who in bygone generations allowed all nations to walk in their own ways. Nevertheless, he did not leave himself without witness, and that he did good, gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. And with these sayings, they could scarcely restrain the multitudes from sacrificing to them.'" And that's about where we got to. And so, Paul runs out into the crowd. They're tearing their clothes. We talked about how that was a Jewish way of showing their distaste, their frustration. They were upset by the things that they had saw. And so they're tearing their outer garment in that mourning, in a sense. And so here they're yelling at the people, no, this is not right. We are just men. He's saying we're just men. We're here to talk to you about the gospel. We're here to tell you about the living God, because of the things that you're worshiping, the idols, the false gods that they worship. Paul said they're useless. When we think about that idolatry, their idolatry was the images. They had Zeus, at the center, not the center, but the front of the city. They had a temple, and then they had a statue to Zeus, and so they would worship that statue that represented this God who, little g, God who they thought was the greatest of all gods. And he's a false god, couldn't do anything. They did nothing for them, just like in Egypt. None of their gods there did anything. And so Paul calls that useless. When you think about today, people aren't putting things out in front of them and saying, well, this is my God, I'm going to bow down and worship it. But they're doing it in how? How do people worship their idols today? Yeah, putting those activities before God. It may be an activity, it may be money, it may be things, putting that before God. And so they're not putting it up on a pedestal like they would have done and bowed down to it, but it's the same thing. And so the principle is the same. Their false gods during that time couldn't do anything for them. Couldn't provide for them. Didn't protect them. It didn't create them. Didn't create the world around them. Same as today. When we talk about money, money seems to give a person a false hope, a false strength, thinking that nothing can happen to me. I can handle it because I've got XYZ amount of money, or I've got this much saved up. That's a false security, right? How many people during the Great Depression learned that money was useless? And the same, we've seen many recessions and things like that during this time of our life, but money can disappear overnight. Things can disappear. And so they're false. They don't protect us. They don't provide for us. They don't do nothing. They are just an inanimate object. And so we can do the same. And so Paul here is saying, I am trying to get you to turn from that, this useless God, to look at the real God. And that real God is the one who created all things. He's the one that gives us rain. He is the one that gives us the fruitful seasons. God causes it to rain on the just and the unjust. They should be able to look around at the world around them and say, there's someone out there who created this. There's someone out there who is keeping this going. You can't say that everything, the whole idea of evolution is that it came from this chaos and everything is in order the way it is today. It couldn't be this massive bang and then everything is just stuck in a pattern of where it perfectly needs to be. It doesn't make sense. God put it there. God is keeping it there. And so they should be able to look around at the world around them and see that there is a true God. And Paul's saying that is who I'm trying to show you is the true God and that you should be worshiping. But were they able to do that? Verse 18. And with these sayings, they could scarcely restrain the multitudes from sacrificing to them. So no matter what they tried to do, the people still wanted to do what they're going to do. You think about that. We might do the same thing. We're not going to be out tearing our clothes in front of people and yelling, don't do that. But we may be showing someone that what their belief in is false. The life that they are living, the direction that they're going, it's useless if it's not in service to God, if it's not focused on eternity. And so we may try to show them that, we may try to tell them that, teach them the gospel that there is something better, but everybody has a choice what they can believe, right? Everybody has a choice what they can do. And so, their frustration, I'm sure, with the people here, saying, we've shown this miracle, we've done all these things, we've told you the gospel, and yet you still want to stick with your idol worship. It's frustrating. It can be frustrating to us today, too, if we work with some people and they don't want to change. They don't want to see the truth. So it's the same thing. Sometimes people can be so ingrained in their doctrine and teachings they can't see anything else. Does that happen? Yeah, it does. It does a lot. And that's just something to think about. All right, so verse 19 and 20 says, "And the Jews from Antioch and Iconium came there, and having persuaded the multitudes, they stoned Paul, dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. However, when the disciples gathered around him, he rose up, went into the city, and the next day he departed with Barnabas to Derbe. And so, notice here we have, Paul had fled from Iconium, right? Because what did they want to do to him in Iconium? Yeah, they wanted to stone him there. Paul got out before they could do it. So what do? They find him. Yeah. They go to the next town and like, okay, well, if he's here, now we can do it. And so they persuaded the multitudes. And what that means is that they got a mob to go after Paul. This would have been comprised mainly of Jews because they're the ones that were upset. But if you have these idol worshipers here who believed Paul and Barnabas in their minds were gods, but then they say they're not, so then they're maybe thinking they're false gods, they want to kill them too, right? And so they got a mob together, and what do? They stone Paul. Now it's interesting, they didn't stone Barnabas. Why is it they only stoned Paul? Yeah. There could be something to that.
Paul was more outspoken.
Yeah, I think Paul was as we talked about with the names that they gave him, he was the spokesman in a sense. And so he was the one standing up, speaking, telling them, yelling this out to them. So, and then also the Jews, they hated Paul more than Barnabas. Every time we've seen it.
In most of the places where they went after a while, they were after him to kill him. So is this new groups of Jews, or is this Jews that's coming to find them?
At this point, it says Jews from Antioch and Iconium. Well, Antioch, this is Antioch. This is one of the first places that Paul came to. Not this Antioch. We're talking about Antioch of Pisidia, which is up here. Pisidia. And so here he is. He's been working in this whole area. And I think that it is a group that's kind of been following him around. I think later on we're going to see they just keep following him everywhere they go. Because remember Antioch, he was in Antioch.
I'm sure the group grows too.
Yeah, I'm sure.
They go.
Yeah. And at this point, they think he's dead, right? So they thought they have accomplished what they were out to do. But they drag him out of the city, so they stone him. And you can imagine the way they stone people is very, very brutal. You can imagine. We think these little tiny stones and they're throwing them. That's not the case. They're taking big, large stones and they're aiming to kill you. And so where are they going to be aiming at? Your head, most likely, right? And so they're probably trying to make sure that he's dead after he falls down. And so throwing more rocks at his head. So you can imagine this is probably pretty bloody, the things that was going on. They thought he was dead. I'm sure they knew how to check for a pulse. I'm sure they knew how to make sure that he wasn't still alive, that he wasn't breathing. So they suppose him to be dead. They drag him out of the city, and they leave. And so now you have the Christians and those that were with him, disciples were with him. They're gathered around him. They think he's dead. So they're probably preparing to bury him. And then all of a sudden, Paul jumps up. Could you imagine that? He's standing there. That's pretty crazy. Was this miraculous? I think it was. Because he was supposed to be dead. I'm sure he wasn't breathing. He didn't have a pulse. They thought he was dead for sure. They wouldn't have just left him. Yeah. He could have, I guess.
They left and he jumped right up.
It just jumped up. Held his heart rate down, I guess. I don't know. Yeah, we don't know. We're not told if it's miraculous or not. It's just interesting that they spent the time to stone him and then drag him out of the city and leave him. And yeah, he could have been just playing possum. He really could have.
Is this the first time he's been stoned?
Yes. Yep. Somebody read 2 Corinthians 11:25. Yeah. I think this is the only time he's stoned, if I remember right.
I'm just thinking, like, if it was a common thing, maybe he's like used
He's
to
know how to
just
figure it
dead.
out.
I
Yeah.
don't think very many people live.
No.
I just wonder why there's just these large stones laying everywhere.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's from their walls, like they fall off the walls. Maybe I don't know. The buildings.
3 times I was beaten with rods, once I was stoned, 3 times I was shipwrecked a night and a day, and I have been in the deep.
All right. So here it says he was stoned once. This is book of 2 Corinthians was written later on in his life, and so this would have been after. Which that chapter 11, is focused on all the things that Paul endured. And it says he was beaten 3 times with rods. There's a lot of things that Paul went through. Some read 2 Timothy 3:10 through 11.
I was laughing because my little commentary thing at the bottom says, Luke does not clearly indicate whether the stoning killed Paul. Maybe Paul himself did not really know.
What? That's interesting. Who knows? We don't know. We're not told. We're just told that he got up. That's interesting. There's some theories on that. We'll look at that here in a second. 2 Timothy 3:10 through 11.
But you have carefully followed my doctrine, manner of life, purpose, faith, long-suffering, love, and perseverance. Persecutions, afflictions, which happened to me at Antioch, and Iconium, and Lystra. What persecutions I endured, and out of them all the Lord delivered me.
All right, so, it's interesting what Paul says there, because here he's recounting to Timothy. This is, 2 Timothy was, I think, the last book Paul wrote, right before he died. And so he's writing to Timothy as he knows he's going to be dying. A lot of the verses in 2 Timothy are written that way. Paul talks about the end of his life and the things that he has done. And here he recounts, and it's interesting, he was persecuted in many, many places. But what is the 3 places he mentions? Antioch, Iconium, and Lystra. Those 3 really stuck out in his mind. And so this was severe persecution that he dealt with in these 3 different areas. And he mentions that. And then also it says in there that he was delivered how? By the Lord. So it could have been that we don't know. We're not told. It's speculation. Now, will somebody read 2 Corinthians 12, 1 through 3? This is an interesting thought when you think about what Paul wrote here.
Now concerning spiritual gifts, brethren, I would not have you ignorant. Ye know that ye were Gentiles carried away unto these dumb idols, even as ye were led. Wherefore I give you to understand that no man speaking by the Spirit of God called Jesus accursed, and that no man can say that Jesus is the Lord, but by the Holy Ghost.
That is not the verse I was thinking of.
Oh, wait.
That's
what mine says.
That's completely different of what I was thinking. Because you said spiritual gifts, I'm like, well, that's chapter 11 that leads up to 12.
12 and 3.
What is it actually?
For me,
What?
doubtless into glory,
We're
I
looking
will
at
come.
2 Corinthians, what?
It's 2 Corinthians 12.
12.
Sorry, Debbie.
That's me. It is not expedient for me, doubtless to glory, that I will come to visions and revelations of the Lord. I knew a man in Christ about 14 years ago, whether in the body I cannot tell, or whether out of the body I cannot tell. God knoweth. Such a one caught up to the 3rd heaven. And I knew such a man, whether in the body or out of the body I cannot tell. God knoweth.
All right, so Paul writes this, and 2 Corinthians is written quite a bit after this time. Paul writes there that he knew a man in Christ who was caught up to the 3rd heaven. He said he didn't know if it was a vision or if he was really there. Paul, he doesn't say it's him, but many people believe that it's Paul here. That this really is Paul who is talking about an experience that he had. Now, if you go back to 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 1, because we're talking in chapter 12, which is what Debbie read, that is talking about the miraculous gifts. But 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 1, Paul talks about if he had the gift, that he had the gift of tongues, and he could speak the tongue of the angels. Somebody read 1 Corinthians 11:1. You used to have that memorized. 1 Corinthians 11:1.
Mine says, be imitators of me as I am of Christ.
13. Sorry. It is 13:1.
I keep asking, but it's like
Ah.
a sentence.
It's 13:1. Sorry.
Okay. If I speak in the tongues of men and of the angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal.
All right. So Paul says there, even he says, I have the gift of speaking in tongues. Not only can he speak in tongues, he can speak the tongues of the angels. And so when you connect that with 2 Corinthians chapter 12, where Paul says he was caught up in the third heaven, Paul is talking about he didn't know if it was a vision or if he really was in the presence of the angels and in the third heaven. So in the Jewish mind, you had the first heaven, which was the sky. You had the second heaven, which would have been the universe, and then the third heaven would be where God resides. And so he said, I know of a man, he doesn't say who it is, it's believed to be Paul, who was caught up in the third heaven, who saw the things that were there, was not able to speak about them. And here Paul says, in another place that he was able to speak the language of the angels. And one reason I go all of that is to say it could have been here at Lystra when he was stoned that he actually did die, or he was knocked out and had this vision, and this was actually when this happened that he writes about in 2 Corinthians. We're not told, there's no definite thing, but it's just interesting the time frame. The only time Paul could have died and come back to life would have been right here in his life, if he had really died. Or he could have, like I said, been playing possum. We don't know. He just laid there dead, pretend like he was dead, and got up. We don't know. We're not told. Just some interesting things to think about. And so, just some connections there. And so, here Paul gets up. What does he do after he gets up?
Goes back into the city.
Yeah, isn't that crazy? The place that thought that was trying to kill him, or thought they killed him, he goes right back in the city. He stays the night. He doesn't just go into the city. He stays the night and gets up the next day and leaves. And not only that, he gets up and leaves and goes to Derbe. And then verse 21, it says, and when they had preached the gospel in that city, which is Derbe, and made many disciples, they returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch. So Paul goes to Derbe, preaches for a period of time, and then continues to go back to these areas that, for one, thought they'd killed him, and all of these cities that he had visited already. Why do you think Paul would go back to those cities? Yeah, he was determined, right? He was determined to see the church grow. In verse 22, it says, strengthening the souls of the disciples, exhorting them to continue in the faith, and saying, we must through many tribulations enter the kingdom of God. And so Paul returns. He continues to encourage them to move forward. And, there's congregations here. Even though they thought they killed Paul, there was disciples living in each one of these cities. The church was there. It was planted. The church was growing. And Paul wanted to go back and to strengthen them. And I'm sure they had all heard that Paul was probably dead, and so to see him would have been really good too. All right, so that brings us to verse 23. Somebody want to read verse 23 through the end of the chapter?
When they had appointed elders for them in every church, with prayers and fasting, they committed them to the Lord in whom they had believed. Then they passed through
Pisidia, yeah.
and came to
Pamphylia, yep.
And when they had spoken the word of Perga, they went down
Adela.
Wrong name.
Adela. Sorry.
And from there they sailed to Antioch, where they had been commended to the grace of God for the work that they had fulfilled. And when they arrived and gathered the church together, they declared that all that God had done with them, and how he had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. And they remained no little time with the disciples.
All right, so verse 23, really going back to verse 22, which I had read, his intentions was to strengthen the church, exhort them. But the last part of that I didn't mention, we must, through many tribulations, enter the kingdom of God. What does Paul mean by that? Yeah. Already they've seen Paul get killed. They thought dead. They could see the persecution is going to be great in this area. And so Paul is telling them, be prepared. It's going to happen. Persecution is going to happen, and you are going to see this happen. Now, it's interesting. He says, we must, through many tribulations, enter the kingdom of God. What is the kingdom? What is the kingdom? The church, right?
So he was encouraging them to continue what they're doing.
Yes. And I think also when you see the kingdom of God talked about here, it's in reference to the church, but where else is the kingdom? Here it's us, but yeah, heaven, right? And so he's telling them to continue to reach your goal, which is heaven. And that's what he's saying. And so it doesn't mean that the kingdom had not in existence yet. We know it is because of Acts chapter 2, verse 47. The kingdom is there. They are, as a person is baptized and converted to Christ, they are added to the church. So it's talking about heaven. He says you need to continue in the faith. You're going to deal with persecutions. And those persecutions are going to continue until you enter heaven. That means it's like a Revelation chapter 2 and verse 10 situation. Be faithful unto death, and you receive a crown of life. That's the part that we quote, but the rest of that verse talks about you'll have tribulation 10 days. It's not literal 10 days. It's a period of time, meaning it's going to be a long time. And so when Jesus was writing to that church, he was saying your persecutions are going to continue. And he's writing to the churches of Asia. And so, some of these cities, Pergamum and Ephesus, all of these cities were some of the cities that he wrote to. They're dealing with a lot of persecution in that area. And so they're going to. Somebody read 2 Timothy 3 and verse 12. All right, so Paul, in talking to Timothy, this is at the end of his life. Remember he said that he mentions a lot of things about the end of his life. But here he is saying that everyone that strives to live godly will suffer persecution. Now, is that persecution all going to be similar? No. When we think about persecution, a lot of times we think about the persecution that the church endured during that time, where they were thrown into prison, where they were killed, where they were cast out of their homes or cities, things like that. But that's not all persecution. Some persecution can be verbal. Some persecution can be in that you're an outcast in groups, things like that. And so those kind of things will happen to those that live godly. Why? Why would that be the case? Yeah. 1 Peter chapter 4, if you read 1 Peter 4, I think verse 4, talks about how people will think it's strange that you do not run in the same excess of riot as them. So people will see that your life is different, and it sometimes can upset them. Some people accept it and go on, like, oh, that's fine. Some people don't. And so persecution can arise from that. And so at some point in our lives, we will endure afflictions, we will endure persecution, and maybe several times in our lives, or maybe our whole life, as they dealt with their whole life, and their focus on Christianity, and their life as a Christian. And so verse 23, it says, so when they had appointed elders in every church and prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord in whom they had believed. And so they go, and these congregations that they're revisiting, Paul is now appointing elders. And so it's believed that it's been about 3 to 5 years since Paul left Antioch for this first time. He's on his first missionary journey. So it could have been up to 5 years. Some say maybe 6 years. We don't know. But as we're going to see at the end of the chapter, Paul has traveled 1,300 miles. That's a lot of miles on foot. We don't know exactly how he traveled, but that's going to take time. And he stopped at 15 different places. And so he spent many times, we see he spends a long time in those places too. So it's been several years that Paul has been going throughout these areas. But you think about it, 3 to 5 years, you're talking about, it's like going to Princeton, where there is no congregation, and planting the church there, and then 3 years to 5 years going back, and there's people ready to be elders. Now, we've talked about this a little bit before when we talked about elders, and we talked about, like in Jerusalem, you had Jews who had been followers of God their whole life. They knew God's principles, his morals, things like that. So when they converted to Christianity, they just had to understand their Messiah has come, they're under the new law now, and so their background is already there. And so it would be easy for many of them to become elders and be qualified because of the life they live. Where are we at now in these cities? These are Gentile nations. They don't have those moral backgrounds. They don't have that foundation that the Jews had. Now, some of these people probably were Jews that were appointed elders, but the church was very infant in its state in these areas. And yet, Paul was able to go back and able to find men that were qualified to be elders. So, we think about how long, like, this congregation has been here. How many years it's been, 50 plus years, 60 years, and we still have never had elders, or we don't have elders. Well, some of the times we'd say, well, we don't have anybody qualified, we don't have, we're still this and that. Actually, you have all kinds of reasons. Here, 3 to 5 years, they have people qualified. And so we'll talk a little more about that. We're out of time.
So what's the significance of praying with fasting?
So it was
Is that a tradition?